Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Fuller Society tour of Hidden London. Now, you all know that we're meeting here today because we should have been meeting in London. Of course, we're not able to do that. So we thought that what we'd do is just give you a little tour of some of the things you may not have seen in London itself. So for the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to be taking you through London. But who am I? Well, my name's Chris Green, and I am going to be your tour manager, as it were. Who am I? Well, I am a Blue Badge guide for London, and the Blue Badge is the highest tourism qualification that we have here in this country. I'm also a City of London guide, and I have to say that the City of London badge is quite. In addition to that, I'm a Blue Badge guide for the South East of England and also for Northumbria. As well as that, I'm a trainer for the Corporation of London, training new City of London guides, and I'm an examiner for the Institute of Tourist Guiding as well. But probably more important for most of you, I am endorsed by Mayflower 400 UK to be the official guide of Rotherhithe, the London Borough of Southwark. And also I've worked with my friend and colleague Isabel, who would have been doing your tour actually of Rotherhithe, to provide the City of London with a guided tour relating to Mayflower. Now, let's get ourselves started this evening. Before I do anything else, I'd like to thank John Fuller for having a chat to us tonight. And John, of course, the leader of South Norfolk Council, and I thought you might like to see a picture of Harleston last weekend when we had our 4th of July celebrations. Now, the 4th of July, obviously terribly important for you, but it was also marking our availability, our allowance to actually go out and celebrate. Our pubs were open for the first time, and we decided that we would have a celebration with our Harleston Kindness Help Hub volunteers, and here they are looking gorgeous, and Mr. Fuller was opening a barrel of beer for everybody to share in. So a lovely day of celebration, obviously harking back to the 4th of July as well. Now, for this evening, I'm going to take you through 4 little subsections, if you like. I'm going to start with an animal safari. So let's take ourselves to the City of London, where, if you know where to look, you will find these rather glorious camels. In fact, this is a building dating to the 1880s. It's Peak House, and the Peaks were importers of tea, coffee, and spices. And that's why they have 3 camels, one for tea, one for coffee, and one for spices. Frankly, I'm not too sure which one's which, but let's just enjoy them. And if you have a very good screen, you may actually be able to see there's a dead camel, just to cheer you all up down here as well. Now, in fact, Peak Brothers was set up by 3 brothers, Richard, William, and James. They were a London tea merchant, and towards the end of the 1800s, they actually represented about 5% of the London tea trade, and that, let me tell you, was pretty serious. They commissioned Peak House as their headquarters building, and although the company traded till 1978, not formally dissolved, in fact, until the early 2000s. But I think for most of us, the building's lovely, but we know Peak Brothers, and by the way, here they are with their 3 camels again. And it's quite interesting to me because they commissioned a man called William Theed to do the carving I showed you a couple of minutes ago. Very, very well-known carver, but he didn't have any choice in what he was going to carve. He was simply carving the logo, as we'd call it here today as well. But the Peak Brothers actually joined together, camel just for fun. The Peak family joined together with the Freens, so Mr. Peak and Mr. Freen, and they were the first people to make what I'm going to call a biscuit in this country. Biscuits, cookies, probably for most of you, but when I say biscuit, I'm talking about a soft biscuit, so not the hard chipped biscuit that would have been served up until then. And for anybody of my generation, we're very fond of Peak Freens. They gave us a favourite biscuit called the Custard Cream. And actually, although the company's now no longer in existence, their factory where they used to operate is still down in Bermondsey, not too far from Rotherhithe. And in fact, in other countries, their name is still licensed. So you can still buy Peak Freens cookies or biscuits if you want to. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time in each place today, so I'm going to take you now to just down the road, in fact, from the camels, and we're having a look at the building. I know I'm advertising, but Cafe Nero here, and you may wonder where's the animal, and we can play spot the animal, can't we, on this one? Well, let me take you slightly closer into the building. And again, I still forgive you if you can't quite see the animal. But what we have here are 2 mice and a piece of cheese. Now, we really don't have any idea why we have 2 mice and a piece of cheese on this building. There are lots and lots of versions as to the story behind this. My own favourite is that when they were building this building, again, the 1800s, then 2 builders who were working on the site were very cross because their sandwiches were disappearing, and they each blamed the other. And in the end, they started quite a serious fight. In the end, obviously separated. But it was eventually discovered that their sandwiches were being stolen by the local rodent population, local mice. So just for fun, they put the mice and the cheese on the building. Actually, this needs a bit of a scrub, it's a bit dirty. But nevertheless, it's quite a fun one. Quite difficult to spot, but I will show you it when you come to London next year. Now, we're now moving on to a local church, not too far from the mice and the cheese. I thought since we've been looking at mice, time to look at cats. I hope you can all spot the cat in this piece of stained glass. I've got a slightly bigger picture for you. There he is, or she. And this is a cat that belonged to a very well-known character in London called Dick Whittington. Some of you may know him. I've got his cat sitting. Let's move that. See here? And Dick Whittington was a very well-known character, a real-life character actually. He was around in the 1300s, but a legend has grown up about him being a poor man who came to London to make his fortune. When he failed to make his fortune, he was leaving London with his cat, of course, and he reached one of our hills, Highgate. And when he was on Highgate Hill, taking a rest because it's quite steep, he heard the bells of the City of London calling him. "Turn again, Dick Whittington, turn again," said the bells. And he turned around with the cat, went back down to the City of London and made his fortune. Now, in fact, according to the legend, it was the cat that made the fortune. The story goes that the cat was a very good mouser or ratter, and there were lots of rats and mice on the chips in the Port of London. And so the cat was hired out to various people to keep their mouse population down. Now, I'm not sure that I believe that particularly, but if you are a fan of 14th century slang, you may know that a cat was an old name for a barge. And so it's quite likely that Dick Whittington actually had a barge, so a boat, and he was able to trade on the boat and make money from that. But the story again is not quite true, because in reality, Dick Whittington was a very rich young man who came from the west of London, and he didn't come to London to make his fortune, he already had one. And in fact, he became Lord Mayor of the City of London on probably 3 occasions, maybe even 4, it's a little bit uncertain, but a very important gentleman who, when he died without family, he left all of his money to the Corporation of London, and we still today have Whittington almshouses, so places where older people can live out of London these days. And at his pièce de résistance, he actually left money to have a new toilet for London. So a 24-seater loo was set up in Whittington's name. Fun, isn't it, to get those things through? Now, I'm going to move it on, and we're going to have a look at something a little bit different. I'm going to say hello to a dolphin now. This one's in Chelsea, actually, so it's way to the west of London. Another version of it here, rather gorgeous, isn't it? And it's interesting when you're looking at pictures, thinking, oh, I'll find that dolphin, I know that dolphin. Walk past it a million times. And I know the sculptor is a man called David Wynne. But what I didn't know was that David Wynne was responsible for designing the back of our 50p coins. You will have seen this. And this is the coin that was minted to celebrate us joining the European community back in 1973. But David Wynne has also given us another piece of animal sculpture. And some of you will have seen this one, I think. This is a gate that was set up for the Queen Mother, the late Queen Mother, so our current Queen's mother. This was her 90th birthday present. And we often joke about what on earth you give somebody who has everything when she's 90. And in the case of the Queen Mother, she got a set of gates. Delighted. But on the gates, as designed by David Wynne, we not only have a red lion and a unicorn, but we also have a rather attractive peacock there as well. But I must show you the rest of the gates. In fact, not designed by David Wynne, designed by a man called Gabriel Lund. And these are immensely controversial because they are very frothy, as you can see. And some people say that they should remind us of the Queen Mother and her frothy frocks that she used to wear. But some people feel these were not necessarily a fitting tribute to the great lady. Anyway, I think they're gorgeous. And again, when you come to London, do come along and say hello to them. Now, not a million miles from there, we have one of our local parks, James's Park. And here we have one of the residents of St James's Park. This is Isla. She is a great white pelican, you'll be delighted to know. And Isla does not live alone in the park. We actually have quite a few other pelicans living with her. In fact, we're currently up to 6. Here we have Sun, Moon and Star, a version of them being fed here actually. Sun, Moon and Star are new. They came from Prague Zoo just under a year ago. And I can't tell the difference actually, but Sun and Moon are the boys and Star is the girl. And Star has a splodge on the top of her beak, on top of her nose, and so we can pick out Star if we need to. These days we're not supposed to get too close to the pelicans, because certainly Sun, Moon and Star, having been hand-reared in Prague Zoo, are now being de-tamed. Not a word I was familiar with actually, rewilded possibly, but we're being discouraged from going near the pelicans for all sorts of reasons, but mostly to make sure that these 3 don't stay tame, that they actually become wild animals. Now, strangely, we've had pelicans living in St James's Park since 1664. And the original pelicans were given to us by the Russians, actually. And the great white pelican is not indigenous to this country. And so it's quite an unusual sight for us to see them. I've seen little brown pelicans in parts of the States, but these are quite large creatures, weighing between 9 and 15 kilos, so up to 30 pounds. So quite seriously large beasts. Now, we have quite a lot of other birds in St James's Park. I'm just going to concentrate on the pelicans today. But whenever any of our royal family or etc. are given a bird, a water bird, then it tends to be put into the water here at St James's Park. So if anybody is a birder, then you'll find a pretty good selection here, including black swans, by the way. And black swans are not indigenous to this country. The black swan comes from Australasia. We have white swans, but it's the black ones that obviously are most famous in the park here. Now, just at the end of St James's Park, again, if we're doing spot the animal, I can hear you saying, well, where's the animal here? Well, it's a slightly sneaky one, actually. What I've got here is a red circle, and the red circle actually hides the grave of a dog. This is a Giro, and Giro was the dog of a man called Leopold van Hosch, name here. And when Giro died in 1934, quite suddenly, nobody quite knows of what, but there are all sorts of rumours, then his master had him buried here. And his master was in fact the German ambassador to this country at the time. And the building with the scaffolding that you see in my cursor here, this building was the German embassy point. So the ambassador buried his dog next door, which makes perfect sense. In fact, 2 years later, the ambassador himself, and here he is, Leopold von Hosch, he sadly passed away. Interesting character, if you look into him, because he was working in London at a time when the Nazis were very much in power in Germany. He was very much anti the way the Nazis were operating, quite unpopular with them. And when he sadly passed away in 1936, very bizarre piece of history coming in here, because he received a send-off from Britain. This is the German embassy just beside us, which we've seen a few minutes ago. Coffin draped in a Nazi flag, which I hope you can see, but carried by British soldiers with their bear skins, which I think, again, we're all familiar with. And I think you can see the wheel. That's part of a 19-gun salute that was fired to celebrate the life of Leopold van Hosch, before he was carried off to Germany and buried in his home country. Interesting man, replaced by a man called Ribbentrop, by the way, whom you may know as being quite well known within the Nazi regime. Now, moving on from Giro the dog, we have moved to Hodge the cat. Hodge, a very fine cat indeed, you'll be glad to know. And Hodge is sitting on a big book. In fact, the big book is a dictionary. And that should give you a clue as to whom Mr. Hodge belonged. He belonged to this man. he's Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson. And Sam Johnson in 1755 published the first dictionary of the English language that we would recognise as an English dictionary. In other words, you get a word, you get a definition of the word, and then you get the word in use. Now, this dictionary is absolutely brilliant to read. And in fact, you find out almost more about Sam Johnson than you find out about words. Let me give you just one example. He describes a lexicographer as a dictionary compiler. Well, so far so obvious. But he then described a lexicographer as a harmless drudge. And that gives you some idea, I think, of the sort of man that he was. Now, Dr. Johnson had many cats, and in fact, I'm not totally convinced that this one is Hodge. Hodge himself was very fond of a snack of oysters. And the man who wrote the biography of Dr. Johnson, who was a man called Boswell, he talked quite a lot about Johnson often breaking off from compiling his dictionary, whatever he was doing, to go off and buy food for Hodge. And in case you think that an oyster is a little bit excessive, and I've got a bigger picture of Hodge there. In case you think that oysters are a little excessive, then oysters back in the 18th century were seriously cheap fast food. So the equivalent of McDonald's or fried chicken and all of those houses here. And it's a rather fun one, isn't it, how much things have changed over those years. Dr. Johnson himself would often go out shopping for Hodge, of course, and he's of him. But he would also pop out a lot to buy his own particular, and he was addicted to. And just opposite this statue, which is not a million miles from his house, is Twinings. And Twinings, as you can see, established in 1706, they still sell tea to this day. And in fact, you may recognise the coat of arms. This is the coat of arms of one of our royals that tells you this is a royal warrant, and the royals still operate, still buy their food or tea in Twinings. And I'm getting away with this one, by the way, because there's a lion here. So, you know, lions make sense to me. And I'm still supposed to be working on my animals on this one. So moving away from Twinings and Mr. Johnson's addiction, let's have a look at what we've seen, as it were. Without making too much fuss, we've been through camels and cats and mice and dogs and pelicans, dolphins and lions and unicorn. And there are more, of course. I can go through many, many other animals. So again, if you want me to, I can take you through a whole 2-hour animal safari, finding all sorts of strange beasties on the streets of London. Now, moving on, I'm going to have a little walk in the footsteps of one of our kings. I'm going to say hello to Charles I. And Charles I was around in the 1600s. And this is a picture I'm quite fond of because it gives you a context where we can find what I think is the best statue of Charles I. This is a statue looking towards the clock tower that today we call the Elizabeth Tower. Many of us know it as the Big Ben Tower, don't we? And in fact, you may have seen pictures of the Big Ben Tower today, and it's completely covered in scaffolding. So this is really an older photograph. But the reason it's important to us is that it shows the back of King Charles I, and it shows his horse's tail. Why is that important? Because King Charles I's horse's tail marks the very heart of London. So if you're driving into London and it says London 20 miles, it is 20 miles to King Charles I's horse's tail. So now you know. In fact, you're right on the edge of Trafalgar Square here, and I've got some other visions of the statue for you. There it is, possibly the more familiar view actually, and another one coming up here. Now, Charles I, and again, we're not here to talk a lot about history this afternoon, but Charles I was the king in the 1600s who thought he could rule without Parliament. And to cut a very long historical story short, he went into Parliament to try to arrest some parliamentarians, and this led directly to a civil war in this country. And at the end of the Civil War, Charles I was put to death. He was put on trial and put to death. And I'll show you his death site and his trial site in a couple of minutes' time. But the statue is quite interesting because this is a contemporary statue. It tells us that it was made in the 1630s by a man called Le Sœur. And in fact, when Charles was put to death, the statue was allegedly melted down. And the people that melted it down made a lot of money by making it into little souvenirs. You can buy your souvenir of Charles I. In fact, in 1660, we decided that we would like a king again, and miraculously, the statue was discovered and has been placed in this spot. A statue with a slightly checkered history, allegedly melted down, but still very much in position. Now, why is it here? Well, I said it's the centre of London. In fact, technically, it's only been the centre of London since the late 1800s, actually. Where we are is a great spot for travellers. We're right at what would have been known as Charing Cross. And Charing Cross today is, in fact, a railway station. There we go. Again, I'm sure many of you have been past Charing Cross. But the cross itself is this thing that looks like a church spire, which has sort of lost its church. Like somebody joked a while ago that it's like a great sunken area. The church is sunk in the ground. It hasn't. It is how it's meant to be. But this is a commemoration of a lady called Eleanor of Castile. In fact, it is Victorian, in other words, late 1800s, but it marks an original that was set up at the end of the 1200s. Now, if you look closely at the cross, you will see there's a figure of a woman on it. And this is Eleanor of Castile herself. She was the wife of Edward I, so another one of our kings. And when she sadly passed away, up in the north of the country, up in a place called Lincoln, then her husband decided he wanted to have her buried in Westminster Abbey in central London. But unfortunately, he didn't feel he could bring her body down intact because it would have rotted on the way. And so he took out her entrails, her insides, and buried them in Lincoln Cathedral. Lovely this, isn't it? Her heart was taken out and buried separately at Blackfriars, one of our monasteries in London. And the rest of her was brought down to London. Now, it took him a fortnight, 14 days to bring her down from Lincoln. And every night where her body rested, he built one of these elaborate crosses. And there are still 2 or 3 of them remaining today. But as I said, this one is in fact a replica, or at least a version from the 19th century. The figure of the lady, I said it was Eleanor, it has various of her attributes on it, and you may be able to see that she's carrying an orb and a sceptre, and that tells you that she's royal, of course. And another one of them actually has a book on it, and that suggests that she could read, which was quite a big deal for a 13th century lady. So that's why the statue of Charles is there. But let's go and have a look at where Charles was actually put to death. This is a building called the Banqueting House. And the Banqueting House is, again, only a couple of 100 yards from the statue we saw a few minutes ago. The building was built by an architect called Inigo Jones. And Inigo Jones was very much of a classical style architect, like. This is one of our first neoclassical buildings, and we'll have a look inside in a minute. But before we do that, let me just say hello to the death scene of Charles I. Here it is. And I didn't want to get too close to this one because, as maybe you can see, Charles is having his head removed, and you may be able to see there's rather a lot of blood spurting out from here. So it's not particularly lovely. So I don't think we need to be too close to that one. The Banqueting House itself, or at least a version of it, let's have a little look inside before we move on. These days, this building is administered by an organisation called Historic Royal Palaces, and they look after places like the Tower of London as well. But this is one of their least visited properties. To give you an idea of the sort of classical style, this glorious main room is in fact a perfect double cube, and you can work that one out if you want to. But the ceiling, one of its great joys, decorated by an artist, Rubens. But let's stick with Charles I for a we're going down to the Great Clock Tower. We saw that a few minutes ago. And we have here a church called St Margaret's. And St Margaret's Church is right next door to Westminster Abbey. For those of you that know the area will know that the Abbey is just off to the right of my slide here. And what I want to draw your attention to actually is the big roof behind St Margaret's Church. This is a building called Westminster Hall. We're going to have a look at that in just a second. But we're going to the back of this building. On the back of the building, you find the head of Charles I. Fairly obviously, it's not really his head. His head is, in fact, with his body. He's buried at Windsor. He's buried at St George's Chapel. But his head has been placed above the doorway of St Margaret's Church. And directly opposite, we have Westminster Hall. And that's, in fact, where Charles I's trial was held. He was accused of treason back in 1649. And standing in front of Westminster Hall, we have Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell was the leader of our parliamentarians when we had that civil war I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, and it was Oliver Cromwell that was instrumental in putting the king to death. So it's one of those rather strange, I guess it's a sense of humour thing, that has Oliver Cromwell, who put to death Charles I, standing opposite his head. And this is one reason why people think that Oliver Cromwell looks slightly chastised, slightly chastened, slightly ashamed maybe, because he's looking directly at the king's head. In reality, things are never that simple, are they? In reality, the statue of Oliver Cromwell was placed here in the early 20th century, and the head of Charles I was only placed in the middle of the 20th. So there's no way the two are really juxtaposed. But it's quite a fun one, again, if I can say fun, somebody's head, to find Oliver Cromwell opposite head Charles I. I've got many other stories about Oliver Cromwell, by the way, which are now. So we have now moved on. I want to go and have a look at sculpture in the city. I thought I wouldn't go straight to the city of London. I would start actually by having a look at the Trafalgar Square area here. And this little beastie is actually called Gift Horse. It was sculpted by an artist called Hans Hacker, and it actually stood in Trafalgar Square in 2015. Maybe some of you saw it. Now, in fact, in Trafalgar Square, we've got a plinth, so a statue base, if you like, which is spare. We haven't actually found anything to put on it. So for the last few years, what we've been doing is holding competitions and asking artists to sort of bid for the site. So we've had some quite bizarre ones. This one, Hans Hacker based his gift horse on a design by a very well-known English artist called George Stubbs, who's very well known for his renditions of horses. I'm not sure Stubbs' horses look quite like this one, but you know, it's there. Again, some of you may have seen this. This one goes back to 2013, and it's a lady called Katharina Frisch, and it's called Hahn-Cock. You may have guessed that. But it, again, very striking when it's sat on its little plinth down here. And the current incumbent of the plinth, which is just about to move on, it should have moved on actually before now, is by an artist called Michael Rakowitz. And this one is quite a complicated title, actually. The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist. And this is harking back to issues in the Middle East at the moment, where an awful lot of art has been destroyed in the name of religion, actually. And this is actually made of recycled date oil cans. It's again quite bizarre, was quite controversial in its day. So what is going to replace it? Well, this is called The End. I'm just going to move that away. This is called The End, and The End is a dollop of cream that has a cherry and a drone and a fly on it. It's by a young artist called Heather Phillipson. She was born at the end of the 1970s. And it's meant to symbolise the ephemeralness, I guess, of our lives up here. It has been made. It's ready to be placed on the plinth. We're just waiting for that to happen. So by the time you guys get here next year, it should be very much in. Now I'm going to take you into the city, and we'll say hello to some of our temporary exhibitions in the city. For the last 10 years or so, we've had a temporary sculpture exhibition in the City of London every year. Quite well-known artists have volunteered to have their works on display for a short period of time. And I thought we'd pick out a couple that have connections with us also in Norfolk as well. So here is a mirror by an artist called Anish Kapoor. And some of you may know Anish Kapoor if you saw our Olympic Games in 2012. Again, this is a large sculpture called, quite simply, Orbit. And we all thought when it was first built as just a work of decoration, that it would make a fantastic, what we call helter-skelter. In other words, sit on a mat and spiral your way around. And actually, to make it useful after the Olympic Games, they actually did turn it into a helter-skelter. Now, in fact, for us up in Norfolk at the moment, we have a stately home called Houghton Hall, and Houghton Hall actually has an exhibition of Anish Kapoor's work, which opened just last weekend. So a few of us who live up here are quite looking forward to going up to have a look at those. And in fact, my next artist is a man called Damien Hirst. And this is the piece that he had on display in sculpture in the city. One of his permanent pieces in the city is this one. This is, I'm afraid, one of my slightly blurry photos. I'm sorry about this. This is St. Bartholomew. It's in St. Bartholomew's Church. And if you know the story of St. Bartholomew, and I'm sorry, it's not funny, he flayed himself alive. So here is the knife that he used to do the flaying. Here is the skin, which was flayed, and here is the muscle work that's sort of revealed from it. Damien Hirst is well known for giving us the insides of creatures, and the next one is actually a horse, sort of, which was on display up at Houghton Hall a couple of years ago when we had a Damien Hirst display. Now, I could spend a lot of time looking at sculpture coming and going in the city, but I thought what I'd do just for a few minutes is to have a look at one space in the city, a space called Leadenhall Market. Some of you will know it, I think. It's a market built in, again, the Victorian era, so the 1880s. It's a place where there's been a market since Roman times, so for almost 2,000 years. It's, of course, guarded by dragons, as most of the city is. And many of you will know it, I think, because it's often displayed a role as a film set. This is where the movie, or some of the Harry Potter movies were filmed. Some of you will know that, I think. And also the John Wayne movie Brannigan had a couple of scenes filmed here as well. But I thought we'd have a look at a couple of site-specific sculptures. That's quite difficult to say. So I'm staying, maybe not. We've got a couple of hands up here, neon hands. And we've got, this one's called Ghost, because it's a kayak without an occupant. Okay, I'm not sure whether we appreciate these or whether we like them. I can't get reactions from you. But again, it's quite an interesting one to see the Victorian splendour of the market and this quite modern little beastie sitting in here. Quite fond of this one. This one is Falling into Reality by a pair of artists called the Recycle Group. And they simply, well, I think it's in the name, isn't it, really? But the whole idea is it's a person falling into the virtual world. And again, I think you can see it's very much the same surroundings going on through there. But what I can do now is to move on to our final section, and we're going to have a look at a few Mayflower moments. And as we go through, I thought we'd stay in the city for a couple of minutes, because another one of our temporary pieces of sculpture is called Sari Garden. And you may be able to see the whole almost watching line of saris, as in Indian garment, out here. This is a lady called Claire Jarrett. There are in fact 12 saris on display here. And it's very, very important for us because this is Heneage Lane. And Heneage Lane in the City of London is probably the most important Mayflower spot. It's really, really important because here was Heneage House. It's all in the name, isn't it, actually? And an awful lot of people that were very important in the Mayflower story had lodgings in Heneage House. Sadly, of course, as you can see, it's no longer with us. But if you know characters like, well, lots of characters anyway, from the Mayflower story were actually kept in here. So a big house, great of rooms, as we say. So William Bradford was here, Cushman was here. Sadly not the Fullers as far as we know, but nonetheless very many of the so-called Pilgrim Fathers would have had lodgings here. And what was most important, and I've got another view of the Sari Garden before I move on, before it faded a bit. What is, I think, not often mentioned is that the City of London played a huge part in actually financing the Mayflower. The Mayflower was a London ship. It was paid for by London money. And this is where London money tends to gather together. This is a building called the Guildhall. The Guildhall has been a place of meeting of the corporation, the city government, since the early 1400s. And in fact, beneath the courtyard, we actually have the old Roman amphitheatre. So an amphitheatre that's almost 2,000 years old. And the modern building just beside us is actually the art gallery of the Corporation of London as well. But this is where the corporation meets, it's where the city government meets, and where the finance for the Mayflower would almost certainly have been discussed. Inside, it's a place these days of banquets as well as council meetings, but it also has the banners of all of our so-called guilds or livery companies. And the one I've chosen to show you here, not terribly clear, this is the mercers or merchants, and the mercers would have played a very, very big part in financing the Mayflower here. So the building is also used, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, for all sorts of other meetings. You may recognise Winston Churchill here, and during World War II, Winston Churchill was given what's become known as the honorary freedom of the City of London because of how much work he did to keep Britain safe at that time. And the statue here in the Guildhall is actually Winston Churchill's 81st birthday present. Again, we could talk a lot about Winston Churchill and his connections with the city, but I think we'll move on. Just a little look at the dais, which is where people sit during meals, and then we'll move ourselves on to Rotherhithe itself. Now, you're all going to visit Rotherhithe when you come and visit us next year. So I don't want to spend an awful lot of time looking at Rotherhithe because we'll spend a lot of time here in reality. But a couple of local characters which sort of tie in with what I'm talking about. We've got Ada Salter on the left and her husband Albert on the right. And in fact, he is sitting in front of a pub called The Angel. So hold The Angel, because I've got The Angel to talk about in a couple of minutes' time. Now, this statue is called Mr. Salter's Daydream. And what he's dreaming of are his daughter Joyce, who sadly died of scarlet fever when she was only 8. And he's dreaming of the family cat and his wife, of course, as well. Now, this is slightly closer up. The Salters spent a lot of time being instrumental in helping the lives of the local people at the beginning of the 20th century. But you can see exactly where we are by looking over behind the cat at the Tower Bridge, which I think you'll all be familiar with, and in fact the cityscape again, which you may be familiar with as well. Now the Salters are a bit of an indulgence, and we can talk about them when you come and visit us. But let's have a look at the pub. Now I think for most of us with the Mayflower story, it is the Mayflower pub, which is the one we think of. And don't worry, I'm going to take you to the Mayflower in just a couple of minutes' time. But the Angel pub is probably much more important in terms of Mayflower history, because this is the pub which has been here more or less in its current position forever. And this is the pub where Christopher Jones, the captain of the Mayflower, would have drunk. And it's almost certainly the place where he hired his crew. So the Mayflower pub itself doesn't have that connection. It's the Angel, which is the biggie for the Mayflower point of view. So let's take ourselves down and have a look at one of the statues on the waterfront here. We're now in Rotherhithe, and this is a statue that I'm very fond of, by a man called Maclean. And this is a statue with a rather lovely name. It's called the Pilgrim, and sorry, it's called the Sunbeam and the Pilgrim's Pocket. Get it right. Maclean was asked to produce a work of art that was figurative and would also be proper, would make sense to the local population. So the pilgrim, fairly obviously. The dog is a Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and they are very popular pets locally. The whole point of this statue is, and I've got some close up for you, is it's a much closer up one of these. So it's the Sunbeam Weekly comic, and the comic was apparently very well known and very well used in the 1930s. And the whole idea here is that the pilgrim, and here is his pocket, is looking over the shoulder of the boy and being totally appalled at what the boy is looking at in this rather frivolous magazine. In the Pilgrim's Pocket, well, we have a crucifix, we have an A to Z, in other words, Advocate around of 1620, and we have a crab claw, of course, commemorating New England as well. The inside of the magazine has the voyage of the Mayflower in cartoon form. So it's a rather fun one, but of course we're now off to the Mayflower itself. Now this is a piece of complete frivolousness. You can all read that it says that in 1620, local Rotherhithe man Christopher Jones moored his ship Mayflower at this jetty, had a skinful, and headed off on its pilgrimage to the land of the free. Well, I think most of us don't believe a word of that, but anyway, let's have a look inside the Mayflower. The Mayflower itself is a lovely pub, of course, But up until the 1950s, it was actually called the spread eagle. So it's only been renamed the Mayflower relatively recently, and it's very much capitalized on that sort of Mayflower connection ever since. So inside, yep, it's lovely and traditional. It also has a frame which contains the facsimile of the names of all of the people that sailed on the Mayflower. And of course, I think you all know that when you come here and you are a descendant of the Mayflower, then you're able to sign the Mayflower Descendants. And I'm hoping that we'll all be able to do that. Yeah, well, you will, I won't. So we're just going to move on to say that next week you will be meeting your guide for Reddenhall Harleston, lovely Gordon, and he will be taking you virtually through Reddenhall, including the church and all sorts of other lovely things that you may not have seen the last time. So we'll bring ourselves to the end. We will stop sharing our screen and we will lead on to any questions if you have them. Thank you very much.